The streets of Moscow and Berlin in the 1930s were alive with the sounds of ambition and fear. Factories in the Soviet Union churned day and night, belching smoke into grey skies. The whirring of machinery was deafening, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers echoed across the vast industrial complexes of the Ural Mountains and Moscow suburbs. Under the iron rule of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union was transforming itself from a largely agrarian society into a military-industrial juggernaut. Trains carried tanks, artillery, and aircraft parts to newly built depots. Soldiers drilled relentlessly, learning to maneuver in harsh winters and across endless plains. Propaganda posters adorned every street, reminding citizens that the motherland demanded sacrifice for strength. Thousands of kilometers west, the atmosphere in Berlin was different but no less intense. Adolf Hitler passed in his office as maps of Europe sprawled across the walls. The Wehrmacht had been rebuilt from humiliation in World War I, now equipped with advanced tanks, mechanized infantry, and the Luftwaffe, a modern air force capable of dominating the skies. Young officers studied Blitzkrieg tactics with meticulous precision, rehearsing the lightning-fast maneuvers that would defend Germany's strategy. Public rallies swelled with cheering crowds. Hitler's promises of restoring Germany to greatness reverberated through every town and village. The nation felt unstoppable. Even as both empires grew, the world watched with apprehension. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were expanding in opposite directions, Stalin consolidating power in Eastern Europe, Hitler seeking Lebensraum in the West and the East. Borders shifted quietly under secret agreements. In 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact stunned the globe, a non-aggression treaty that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland was carved in two, the Baltic states fell under Soviet control, and a fragile peace held, but it was only temporary. Behind the diplomatic maneuvering, both nations were building war machines capable of annihilating the other, or much of the world. Soviet factories produced T-34 tanks and Katyusha rocket launchers. German arsenals produced panzer divisions, Steka-div bombers, and mechanized infantry. Millions of soldiers trained for a war that nobody admitted would come, while civilians endured the pressure of rationing, forced labor, and political indoctrination. The first spark of confrontation had not yet been struck, but the continent was already trembling. Soldiers sharpened bayonets, generals studied maps, and nations waited, young knowingly standing at the edge of the most brutal war in history. The stage was set, two totalitarian empires, each convinced of its supremacy, were on a coalition course that would soon engulf Europe in fire and blood. And as winter approached, neither Stalin nor Hitler could foresee the scale of devastation, or the resilience of the people who would fight to survive. The morning of June 22, 1941, dawned over the Soviet Union with an eerie calm. Villages along the western frontier were still silent, farmers tending fields unaware that the greatest invasion in history was about to begin. Then, without warning, the sky erupted in noise. Thousands of Luftwaffe planes roared overhead, dropping bombs on airfields, railways, and cities. The German Blitzkrieg had begun. Along the vast eastern front, columns of tanks and mechanized infantry surged forward with terrifying speed. Adolf Hitler's strategy relied on overwhelming force, rapid encirclements, relentless bombardment, and coordinated assaults designed to destroy Soviet command before it could react. Soviet troops were caught off guard, supply lines were shredded, and panic rippled through towns as thousands of soldiers scrambled to respond. Inside Moscow, Joseph Stalin sat in his office, expression unreadable. Early reports of destroyed airfields and advancing German armored divisions came in wave after wave. Many adversaries urged immediate surrender or negotiation, but Stalin refused. "This is not the end," he said quietly. "The motherland will endure." Orders were issued to evacuate critical industries eastward, beyond the Urals, where tea would be safe from German reach. Factories, machinery, and inshore labor forces were transported by rail into harsh terrain, a desperate gamble to preserve the means of war. Meanwhile, generals like George Zhukov organized a defense unlike any before. Cities like Leningrad and Moscow were fortified, trenches dug, and scorched earth tactics employed. Civilians were mobilized to assist in the war effort, burning crops and destroying bridges to slow the enemy. The Red Army faced repeated defeats, but each losses taught valuable lessons in resilience and adaptation. As the German advance pressed eastward, the sheer scale of the Soviet Union became a weapon in itself. Endless forests, frozen rivers, and brutal heat were called stretched supply lines and exhausted troops. Every meal gained by the invaders demanded a greater cost, and the Soviets used time, terrain, and the population itself as strategic tools. Partisans harassed supply lines, ambushed convoys, and spread chaos behind enemy lines. By winter, the German advance had slowed. At Moscow, the Wehrmacht met its first decisive obstacle, a city fortified not only with walls and barricades but with the determination of a people who refused to surrender. Soviet reinforcements arrived from Siberia, hardened by frost and long marches, turning the tables on exhausted German soldiers. From the ruins of initial defeat, a transformation began. The Soviet Union would not just survive, it would learn, adapt, and fight back with a ferocity the world had never seen. The war was no longer just about territory, it was about the survival of an ancient empire, and the Red Army was rising to meet the challenge, preparing for a counteroffensive that would shock the world. By the end of that winter, the first seeds of the Soviet push westward had been sown. Germany, once unstoppable, had encountered the harsh truth. Invading the USSR was not merely a military campaign, it was a battle against a nation's will, geography, and resilience, all fused into a force capable of turning the tide. By 1942, the war had transformed into a conflict of unimaginable scale and brutality. The German advance had been slowed, but the Wehrmacht remained powerful, its divisions spread across thousands of kilometers of frozen terrain. The Soviet Union, battered yet unbroken, had begun to harness its full industrial and human potential. Factories in the Urals churned out T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, and rifles at a pace that Europe had never seen, while millions of men and women trained relentlessly to defend the motherland. The Battle of Stalingrad became the turning point. The city on the Volga was a strategic prize, and both Hitler and Stalin understood its symbolic and military value. Streets became killing fields, factories transformed into fortresses, and the air was filled with smoke, fire, and the screams of battle. George Zhukov orchestrated a strategy of encirclement, cutting off the German 6th army from supply lines and trapping them in a death grip. Winter descended with brutal severity, amplifying hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion on both sides. The Germans, once confident in their Blitzkrieg, now faced a siege they could neither break nor escape. Starvation, constant bombardment, and relentless Soviet tactics wore them down. The T-34 tanks, robust and adaptable, rallied through ruined streets, while Soviet artillery rained destruction on fortified positions. Civilians, soldiers, and partisans alike contributed to the defense, their resilience amplifying the Red Army's strength. Meanwhile, battles raged across the Eastern Front, from the massive tank clashes at Kursk to relentless partisan operations behind German lines. Supply lines were stretched thin, morale faltered, and Hitler's strategy began to collapse under the weight of attrition and geography. Every kilometer gained by the Germans cost them more than they could replace, while the Soviets continued to rebuild and reinforce. By 1944, the Red Army had gone on the offensive. Operation Bagration shattered the German Army Group Center, reclaiming vast swathes of Belarus and Eastern Poland. The push continued relentlessly westward, Soviet soldiers advancing through forests, rivers, and cities devastated by years of occupation and warfare. The final march into Berlin in April 1945 was a culmination of years of sacrifice, strategy, and unyielding endurance. Soviet troops fought street by street, house by house, until the Reichstag was finally taken, signaling the fall of Nazi Germany. Millions of soldiers and civilians had perished, but the Soviet Union emerged victorious, its military transformed into a global superpower. The war had shown the contrast between two empires, Germany, relying on rapid tactics and technological superiority, and the Soviet Union, thriving through industrial might, sheer manpower, and unbreakable resolve. The continent lay in ruins, but the outcome demonstrated the ultimate lesson of endurance over speed, resilience over brilliance, and strategy that could harness and ensure nation's will. Even as victory celebrations began, the Soviet leadership understood that the world had changed forever. A new era of geopolitical tension, the Cold War, was already forming, and the lessons of sacrifice, industrial power, and military strategy would shape global politics for decades to come. The story of the Soviet Union vs. Nazi Germany was not only a tale of war, it was a testament to the endurance of an empire forged under fire, and the stark consequences when ideology and ambition collide.